The Slow Rise of Ancient Egypt. Welcome to Sleepy Histories. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to drift together through the slow rise of ancient Egypt, a story that unfolds over thousands of years, along the banks of a great river, under endless skies. There are no urgent moments here, no need to remember names or dates. Just let the words wash over you like warm sand, like the gentle lapping of the Nile against its banks. Before we begin, take a slow breath in and out. Let your shoulders soften. There's nowhere else you need to be. We'll start long before the pyramids, before the pharaohs wore their crowns, back when the Sahara was still green, and the first farmers were learning to plant seeds in the dark earth. If you enjoy gentle history stories to help you relax and fall asleep, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Green Sahara and the First Wanderers. If you could travel back 10,000 years, you wouldn't recognize North Africa. Where today we see an ocean of sand, stretching endlessly under the sun, there were once grasslands. Shallow lakes reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. Herds of animals moved slowly across the plains, antelope with graceful curved horns, wild cattle, even elephants with their young following close behind. The rain fell more often then, in gentle cycles, nourishing the earth with a patience that modern weather has forgotten. Small groups of people lived in these grasslands. They moved with the seasons, following the animals, gathering wild grasses and roots, their lives shaped entirely by the rhythms of nature. They made simple tools from stone, sitting in the evening light, chipping away flakes until the edges were sharp enough to cut hide or scrape wood. Each strike of stone against stone made a small, sharp sound that echoed across the quiet plains. In the evenings, they gathered around fires. The smoke rose into the vast African night, where stars blazed with an intensity we can barely imagine now, unpolluted by any human light. Children listened to stories told by elders, stories about the animals, about the sky, about the spirits that lived in rocks and trees and water. These stories were their history, their science, their religion, all woven together into a single tapestry of understanding. The people knew the land intimately. They knew which plants were good to eat and which would make you sick. They knew where the animals went to drink, where they gave birth, when they migrated. They knew how to read the sky, predicting rain by the color of clouds, the behavior of birds, the smell of the wind. They made simple shelters, frames of bent branches covered with animal hides or woven grass. These could be dismantled and carried when the group moved on. Possessions were few: tools, weapons, water containers made from gourds or animal stomachs, perhaps a few shells or colorful stones valued for their beauty. Life was hard in ways we can barely imagine. Infant mortality was high. Injuries could be fatal. Hunger was a constant companion when the rains failed or the herds moved elsewhere. Yet there was also a kind of freedom, a closeness to the natural world that we've lost. Every sunrise was witnessed. Every star was known by name. No one knows exactly when the climate began to change. It happened slowly, imperceptibly, over centuries. Perhaps in any single lifetime, you wouldn't notice much difference. But generation after generation, the pattern shifted. The rains became less frequent. The wet season grew shorter. The grasslands became patchier, the green fading to brown earlier each year. The lakes began to shrink, their edges retreating year by year, leaving behind white crusts of salt that glittered harshly in the sun. The animals felt it first. The herds grew restless, ranging farther in search of water and fresh grazing. The people followed, as they always had, but now the journeys grew longer, harder. Some groups moved north, toward the Mediterranean coast. Others moved south. But many drifted east, drawn by rumors and glimpses of something remarkable, a long, green ribbon of life that cut through the growing desert like a promise. A river. The Egyptians would later call it Itaru, which simply meant the river, as if there were no other river in the world worth naming. We know it as the Nile. The Nile was unlike other rivers. Most rivers swell unpredictably with rain, sometimes flooding with violence, sometimes drying to a trickle. But the Nile followed a gentler, more dependable rhythm, as if it understood the needs of the people who would come to depend on it. Every year, far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia where the river began, the summer rains would fall. The water would travel north, slowly, gathering tributaries, growing stronger, until finally, in late summer, the Nile would rise. It didn't flood with violence or terror. It rose steadily, patiently, spilling over its banks and spreading across the floodplain like a careful gardener watering seedlings. The water was rich with silt, dark, fertile mud carried down from the mountains, ground fine by the journey. When the flood receded, it left behind a layer of this silt, like a gift renewed each year, transforming the valley into the most fertile land in the ancient world. The first people who settled along the Nile must have felt they had found paradise. Water, always. Fertile soil, renewed annually. Fish in abundance. Birds, ducks, geese, herons, ibises, gathering in the marshes. Papyrus reeds growing thick along the banks, useful for everything from boats to baskets to writing material. But they also faced new challenges. Living by a river meant learning its moods, understanding its cycles. It meant staying in one place, or at least returning to the same places year after year. It meant, slowly, beginning to transform from wanderers into settlers. Chapter 2. The Dawn of Farming and Settled Life. Learning to farm is not a single moment of discovery, not a flash of inspiration that changed everything overnight. It happened slowly, through countless small observations, experiments, failures, and gradual successes spread across generations. It was less like inventing something new and more like slowly remembering something the earth had always known. The people noticed that wild grasses, emmer wheat and barley, grew thickly along the riverbanks after the annual flood. The seeds were small but nutritious. Gathered and ground between stones, they could be made into a coarse flour, mixed with water and baked on hot stones into simple flatbread. Perhaps someone spilled a handful of seeds near their shelter and noticed, weeks later, that new plants had sprouted in that exact spot. Perhaps they tried scattering seeds deliberately, in a patch of soft mud left by the receding flood, and waited through the growing season to see what would happen. The first harvest from those scattered seeds must have seemed like magic. Over time, through trial and error, they learned which seeds grew best. They began to save the largest, healthiest grains from each harvest to plant the following year. Generation by generation, the plants changed, becoming more suited to cultivation, their seeds larger, their stalks stronger. The relationship between people and plants was mutual, each was shaping the other. They learned to break the hard ground with wooden sticks, and later, with tools made from stone and bone attached to handles. They learned the best time to plant right after the flood receded, when the soil was still moist and soft. They learned to build small channels and dikes to guide water from the river to their fields, extending the growing season. Farming changed everything, though the change was invisible at first, unfolding too slowly to see. When you farm, you stay in one place. You build more permanent homes, not just shelters for a season, but structures that might last years, even generations. You store grain in clay pots and woven baskets, stacking them in dry places, protecting them from moisture and rodents. You begin to accumulate things, tools, pottery, furniture, clothing. Villages formed along the Nile, small clusters of mud brick houses with flat roofs. The bricks were simple to make, Nile mud mixed with straw, shaped in wooden molds, dried in the sun until hard as stone. The roofs were flat because rain was rare. They became extra living spaces where people slept on hot nights, where grain was spread to dry, where children played. The people woke with the sun and worked in the fields, their hands dark with soil, their backs bent under the weight of baskets and tools. They knew every plant in their fields, watching them grow from green shoots to golden grain, as protective as parents with children. Children learned to tend the animals, goats and sheep at first, and later, cattle brought from the grasslands. The animals provided milk, meat, leather, and eventually, labor. Oxen could pull plows and carry heavy loads. Donkeys became essential for transport. In the evenings, the air would fill with the smell of baking bread, the first food that needed to be cooked rather than simply gathered or roasted. Women ground grain on stone querns, a rhythmic, meditative task that could take hours. The flour was mixed with water and a bit of saved dough from the previous day, the first sourdough starter, though they didn't call it that, and shaped into loaves. Bread and beer became the staples of Egyptian life. Beer wasn't like modern beer, it was thick, nutritious, slightly sweet, made from partially baked bread crumbled into water and left to ferment. It was safer than river water and provided calories and nutrients. Even children drank it, and workers received it as part of their rations. Life was still hard. The desert pressed in on both sides of the river valley, hot and lifeless, a constant reminder of what lay beyond the narrow strip of green. The sun was merciless in summer. Insects, flies, mosquitoes, scorpions were constant irritants. Disease was common. But the river kept flowing, and the floods kept coming, and slowly, the people learned to trust in this rhythm. They also learned to prepare for lean years. Sometimes the flood was lower than usual, and the harvest suffered. They learned to store extra grain in good years, to ration carefully, to help neighboring villages when they could. This practice of storage and redistribution would later become fundamental to Egyptian government. The villages weren't isolated. People traded with each other, grain for fish, pottery for tools, cloth for jewelry. Marriages linked families between villages. Disputes arose over water rights, boundaries, theft, and had to be settled. Leadership emerged naturally, elders whose wisdom was valued, strong individuals who could organize defense or mediate conflicts, perhaps priests who claimed to speak for the gods. Religion was woven into every aspect of daily life. The people worshipped gods of the river, the sun, the harvest, the desert, the animals. Each village had its own patron deity, its own sacred places. The gods weren't distant or abstract, they were present in everything, in the rising of the Nile, the flight of birds, the birth of calves, the ripening of grain. Simple shrines appeared, a special tree, a rock formation, a spot where the earth seemed to speak. People left offerings, food, flowers, small carved figures. They asked for good harvests, healthy children, protection from disease and enemies. They gave thanks when prayers were answered. Death became more elaborate. In the earliest times, bodies were simply buried in shallow graves at the edge of the desert, where the hot, dry sand naturally preserved them. But as society grew more complex, so did burial practices. The dead were placed in larger graves, lined with mats, surrounded by possessions they would need in the afterlife: tools, weapons, food jars, jewelry. This implies something profound: they believed in an afterlife, a continuation of existence beyond death. The body needed to be preserved because the soul, whatever they imagined that to be, needed it. This belief would grow, over centuries, into the elaborate mummification practices in massive tombs that Egypt is famous for. The Nile dictated everything. It was mother, father, God, and calendar all at once. The year divided itself naturally into 3 seasons, each defined by the river's cycle. Ake, the inundation, came in summer, late June through September in our calendar. The river rose slowly, steadily, until finally it spilled over its banks and the fields disappeared under a calm sheet of water. This was a time of waiting, of rest from fieldwork. Farmers turned to other tasks, repairing tools, weaving cloth, building or maintaining their homes, perhaps working on community projects. Then came Parate, the growing season, October through February. The waters receded, leaving behind their gift of fresh, dark silt. The fields were soft, easy to work. This was the busiest time, plowing, planting, tending the crops as they grew. The air smelled of damp earth and green growth. Everyone worked, men, women, older children, from dawn to dusk. Finally, Shimu, the harvest season, arrived in spring, March through May. The grain had turned golden, dry, ready. The farmers cut it with sickles made of wood with flint blades hafted along the edge. They bundled the stalks and carried them to threshing floors, flat, hard surfaces where oxen trampled out the grain. The chaff was winnowed away by tossing the grain into the air and letting the wind carry away the lighter husks. The work was exhausting, but there was satisfaction in it. To see the granaries fill, to know your family would eat through the year, to have surplus to trade, this was wealth, security, success. Beyond the narrow strip of fertile land, perhaps only a few miles wide in places, the desert waited, hostile, empty, yet strangely protective. The Egyptians called the fertile valley Kemet, the black land, after the rich dark soil left by the flood. The desert they called Dishret, the red land, after its reddish sand and rock. The contrast was absolute, almost shocking. You could stand with 1 foot in life and 1 foot in death, in green fields and red desert, separated by a line you could walk across in minutes. The desert protected Egypt from invaders. There were no easy routes into the valley, no gentle borders where armies could mass. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea, useful for trade but not easy to cross in the small boats of the time. To the south, the cataracts, 6 stretches of rapids where the Nile crashed over rocks, making navigation difficult or impossible. To the east, the harsh Sinai Desert and the Red Sea. To the west, the Sahara, stretching thousands of miles. Egypt was isolated, but not entirely alone. Traders came from Nubia to the south, bringing gold and ivory and exotic animal skins. There was contact with the Levant to the northeast, bringing new ideas, new materials, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, silver from Anatolia, cedar wood from Lebanon. But these influences arrived slowly, filtered through distance and desert, and Egypt remained fundamentally itself, distinct from other cultures. This isolation would shape Egyptian civilization profoundly. While other ancient cultures rose and fell, conquered and were conquered, Egypt endured, relatively unchanged, for 3,000 years, longer than the span from the birth of Christ to the present day. The river and the desert created a world that was, in many ways, perfect in its isolation, stable in its rhythms, eternal in its confidence. Chapter 3. The Naqada Culture and the Pre-Dynastic Period. As centuries passed and the villages grew, they began to differ from one another, developing distinct identities. Each village had its own styles of pottery, its own burial customs, its own preferred gods, its own minor variations in how they built houses or wove cloth. These differences might seem small, but they were the beginning of regional identities that would persist throughout Egyptian history. Archaeologists have named one of the most important pre-dynastic cultures after the site where it was first discovered, Naqada, in Upper Egypt, about 350 miles south of modern Cairo. The Naqada culture flourished roughly from 4000 to 3100 BCE, and it spread gradually up and down the Nile, becoming the dominant culture of pre-dynastic Egypt. The Naqada people made beautiful pottery, and this pottery tells us much about their lives. The earliest Naqada pottery was red with black tops, achieved by inverting the pot in the kiln during firing, leaving the rim in contact with smoke. Later styles included buff-colored pots decorated with painted images, boats with many oars, stylized mountains or landscapes, animals including hippos and crocodiles, and human figures, sometimes dancing, sometimes hunting, sometimes in what appear to be ritual poses. These images are windows into their world. The boats suggest that river travel was important, that trade and communication between villages was growing. The animals remind us that the Nile Valley was wilder then. Hippos were common and dangerous, emerging from the water to trample crops or attack boats. Crocodiles basked on riverbanks, their presence a constant threat and also a symbol of the river's power. The Naqada people buried their dead with increasing care and elaboration. The graves were simple pits dug into the desert sand at the edge of the cultivated land, but they were lined with mats and sometimes wood. The bodies were placed on their sides, knees drawn up, hands near the face, the fetal position, as if preparing for rebirth. Around them were placed objects for the afterlife, food in clay jars, tools, weapons, jewelry, cosmetic palettes for grinding eye makeup. This last detail is particularly interesting: cosmetic palettes, often carved from slate in the shapes of animals or geometric forms. The Egyptians, both men and women, lined their eyes with kohl, a dark powder made from galena, a lead ore. This wasn't mere vanity. The dark makeup reduced glare from the intense sun and may have had some antiseptic properties. But it was also beautiful, and beauty mattered to them. Even in death, they wanted to look their best for eternity. As the Nakata culture evolved, trade networks expanded. Copper was brought from the Sinai Peninsula, requiring expeditions into harsh desert, mining or from surface deposits or shallow pits. The copper was smelted, heated in simple furnaces until it melted, then poured into molds to make tools and weapons. Copper tools were sharper and more durable than stone, a significant technological advance. Turquoise and malachite, bright blue and green stones, were also mined in the Sinai and prized for jewelry and decoration. Gold came from Nubia to the south, either panned from river sands or mined from quartz veins. Gold was sacred, associated with the sun, eternal and incorruptible. Even then, before the pharaohs, it was the most valued metal. Some villages grew wealthy, their leaders accumulating more goods, building larger houses. The graves of these leaders became more elaborate, deeper, larger, with more grave goods. We can see the beginnings of social stratification, of hierarchy, of some people having more power and wealth than others. This raises questions. How did some people become wealthy while others remained poor? Was it through successful farming, producing surplus grain? Through trade, acting as middlemen between different regions? Through force, dominating neighboring villages and extracting tribute? Through religious authority, claiming special access to the gods? Probably all of these factors played a role. Wealth brings power, and power brings more wealth. Successful farmers could support more people, creating a larger village with more workers and warriors. Skilled traders accumulated exotic goods and connections. Strong warriors could raid weaker villages or defend their own. Priests who could predict the Nile flood or claim to were valuable and respected. Slowly, these wealthy villages began to dominate their neighbors. A powerful village might extract tribute from smaller nearby settlements, a portion of their harvest, access to their labor, allegiance in disputes or conflicts. In return, the dominant village offered protection and perhaps redistribution in lean years. Over generations, these clusters of villages under a single leader grew into proto-kingdoms, territorial units larger than villages but not yet true states. We can identify several such kingdoms in pre-dynastic Egypt, Hierakonpolis, Nakata, Thinis, and others in Upper Egypt, Buto, Sais, and others in Lower Egypt. Upper and Lower Egypt, the names seem backward to us, but they made perfect sense to the Egyptians. The Nile flows north, from the highlands of Africa to the Mediterranean. So Upper Egypt is the southern, upstream part, narrow and clearly defined. Lower Egypt is the northern delta, where the river branches into multiple channels and spreads out across a broad, marshy plain before reaching the sea. These two regions were geographically and culturally distinct. Upper Egypt was arid, the desert close on both sides, the culture more conservative, more focused on tradition. Lower Egypt was more fertile, with more water, more vegetation, more contact with the Mediterranean world and foreign influences. The people spoke different dialects, worshipped different gods, wore different styles of clothing. We know very little about the leaders of pre-dynastic Egypt. They left no written records, only traces in the archaeological record, elaborate graves, ceremonial objects, images carved on rocks and pottery. But we can imagine them, chieftains or early kings, respected for their wisdom or feared for their strength, making decisions about when to plant, how to distribute grain, whether to trade or fight with neighboring groups. They probably held religious authority as well as political power. In small societies, leadership is rarely divided into separate spheres. The person who speaks to the gods is the person who makes important decisions. The person who owns the most land distributes the most food. The person with the most warriors settles disputes. Religion permeated everything. The people worshipped gods of natural forces, the river, the sun, the wind, the flood. They worshipped animal gods, the crocodile god Sobek, the falcon god Horus, the cow goddess Hathor, the lioness goddess Sekhmet. Each village had its patron deity, and when villages united, their gods united too, merging or forming family relationships in the mythological realm. The concept of Ma'at was forming, though they didn't yet have that specific word. Ma'at would later mean truth, order, balance, justice, cosmic harmony, the natural order of things as they should be. But already, the Egyptians were beginning to see the world in these terms: cycles that must be maintained, balance that must be preserved, chaos that must be kept at bay. The Nile's reliable flood was Ma'at. The sun rising each morning was Ma'at. A good harvest, a just ruler, honest speech, proper burial, all of these were Ma'at. Drought, violence, lying, disorder, disrespect for the dead, these were Isfet, chaos, the opposite of Ma'at, the forces that threatened to unmake the world. This worldview would become central to Egyptian civilization. The king's primary duty would be to maintain Ma'at. When Egypt was strong and prosperous, Ma'at prevailed. When Egypt fell into civil war or foreign domination, it was because Ma'at had been broken and Isfet had gained the upper hand. By around 3500 BCE, the pre-dynastic period was reaching its culmination. The small proto-kingdoms were consolidating into larger ones. In Upper Egypt, a kingdom centered on Hierakonpolis was growing dominant. In Lower Egypt, several kingdoms vied for control of the delta. Conflicts between these kingdoms were probably frequent raids for cattle, disputes over water rights or boundaries, attempts to extract tribute or establish dominance. We have some evidence of violence: bodies with weapon injuries, fortified settlements, ceremonial maces, and weapons buried in elite graves. But there was also trade and intermarriage, alliances, and cultural exchange. The same pottery styles appear in both Upper and Lower Egypt. The same gods were worshipped, with regional variations. A sense was developing that all these people, despite their differences, were part of something larger: a single culture, a single land defined by the river. The stage was set for unification. Chapter 4: The Unification and the Birth of Dynastic Egypt. Around 3100 BC, though the exact date is uncertain and scholars gently debate it, something momentous happened. The many small kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt came together under a single ruler. For the first time, one king ruled the entire length of the Nile Valley, from the Mediterranean to the First Cataract. Tradition names this ruler Narmer, or sometimes Menes. The sources are unclear, and it's quite possible these were different names for the same person, or perhaps the unification took place over several generations and was later compressed into the story of a single legendary founder. What we do have is a remarkable artifact that has survived 3,000 years, the Narmer palette, a ceremonial stone tablet about 2 feet high, carved on both sides with intricate, symbolic images. It was discovered in 1898 at Hierakonpolis, in a temple deposit, and it's now one of the most studied objects in Egyptian archaeology. On one side of the palette, a tall king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt raises a mace over a kneeling captive. Behind the king stands a small figure carrying his sandals, a servant. Above, a falcon, the god Horus, perches on a clump of papyrus plants, holding a rope attached to a human head, as if the god himself is delivering enemies to the king. On the other side of the palette, the same king wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. He walks in procession with his attendants toward rows of decapitated enemies, their heads placed between their legs, a graphic image of conquest. Below, 2 long-necked felines intertwine, their necks forming a circle, the central depression where cosmetics would be ground. The intertwined animals may symbolize the union of Upper and Lower Egypt, 2 lands becoming one. Does this depict an actual conquest, a violent military unification? Or is it symbolic, representing the union of the 2 lands through marriage alliances, trade agreements, and shared religious beliefs? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Violence likely played a role, but so did diplomacy, marriage, economic integration, and the slow realization that unified Egypt would be stronger, more prosperous, more able to organize large projects and defend against external threats. Some scholars suggest that the unification was preceded by a period of close contact and gradual cultural merging, with the final political unification being almost inevitable. Others emphasize the conquest narrative, pointing to the violent imagery on the marmor palette and other early ceremonial objects. What matters most is the result: Egypt was unified. One king ruled from the Mediterranean to the First Cataract, from the eastern desert to the western. The king established a capital at Memphis, a new city built strategically where Upper and Lower Egypt met, where the river valley opened into the broad delta, where the king could control both regions equally. Memphis would remain one of Egypt's most important cities for 3,000 years. The very name, Men-Nefer, established and beautiful, suggests confidence, permanence, a sense that this was a new beginning, the founding of something eternal. This was the beginning of the first dynasty, the start of what Egyptologists call the early dynastic period. The king was not yet called pharaoh. That word, meaning great house, originally referring to the palace itself, wouldn't come into use until much later. But the king was already seen as more than human. He was the son of the gods, particularly Horus, the falcon god. When the king sat on his throne, Horus sat with him, looking through his eyes. The king was the intermediary between the gods and humanity, the one who maintained Ma'at, who ensured the Nile would flood, the sun would rise, order would prevail over chaos. This divine kingship became the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. The king wasn't just a political leader or military commander, he was a cosmic necessity. Without him, the world would fall into chaos. The flood might fail. The sun might not rise. Enemies might destroy Egypt. This belief gave the monarchy enormous power and legitimacy, but also enormous responsibility. The early kings faced the challenge of actually governing this newly united land. Egypt was large, nearly 600 miles from north to south, and communications were slow. A message sent from Memphis might take weeks to reach the southern frontier and weeks more for a reply to return. The kings needed administrators to govern local regions, collect taxes, usually paid in grain, organize labor for royal projects, and dispense justice. They needed scribes to keep records. The hieroglyphic writing system was developing rapidly now, moving beyond simple pictures to a complex system that could record names, events, quantities, ideas. The earliest hieroglyphs were pictographic: a bird was a bird, a house was a house, a loaf of bread was a loaf of bread. But quickly they developed phonetic values. A picture could represent not the thing it depicted but the sound of the word for that thing. This allowed scribes to write anything that could be spoken, though the system remained complex, with hundreds of signs and no vowels marked. Writing was power. It allowed the centralization of government, the recording of tax obligations and payments, the standardization of laws and regulations, the preservation of royal decrees and religious texts. Those who could read and write, the scribes, formed a privileged class, exempt from manual labor, respected and relatively well paid. The kings of the first and second dynasties built tombs for themselves at Abydos and Saqqara, large rectangular structures made of mud brick called mastabas, from the Arabic word for bench because of their shape. These weren't yet pyramids, but the concept was the same. The tombs were stocked with everything the king would need in the afterlife: food in sealed jars, beer in clay vessels, furniture, clothing, jewelry, tools, weapons. Small rooms off the main burial chamber were filled with these goods, thousands of objects, a complete household transported into eternity. Some of the goods were people. In the very earliest dynasties, retainers, servants, guards, even family members, were sometimes buried with the king, sacrificed so they could continue their service in the afterlife. Dozens of subsidiary graves surround the tombs of the first kings, containing the bodies of young men and women, killed at the time of the king's burial. This practice was gradually abandoned, replaced by symbolic representations. Small figurines called shaptus answerers were placed in the tomb. These were magical servants who would come to life in the afterlife and do the work on behalf of the deceased. Over time, tombs might contain hundreds of shaptus, each inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, ensuring they would fulfill their function. Society was becoming more hierarchical, more stratified. At the very top, the king and his immediate family, his wives, children, perhaps his mother, who might wield considerable power. Below them, nobles and high officials, many of whom were related to the king by blood or marriage. Then priests, who conducted daily rituals in temples and maintained the cults of the gods. Scribes, who recorded and administered. Craftsmen, sculptors, jewelers, carpenters, potters, whose skills were valued and rewarded. Soldiers, who protected Egypt's borders and maintained internal order. And at the bottom, making up the vast majority of the population, the farmers. They worked the fields as their ancestors had for millennia, planting and harvesting, paying their taxes in grain, occasionally conscripted for royal building projects or military campaigns. Their lives were hard, shaped by endless labor and the capricious whims of nature and king alike. Yet they were the foundation of everything. Without their labor, the fields would lie fallow, the granaries empty, the kingdom would collapse. But compared to later periods, Egypt was still small, still finding its way. The kings controlled the Nile Valley, but their authority was probably weaker in distant regions, in the oases of the western desert, in the remote areas near the cataracts. Local leaders, who would later be called nomarchs, governors of nomes or districts, governed their own regions with considerable independence, as long as they acknowledged the king's supremacy and paid their taxes. The system was fragile. Royal succession was not always smooth or clear. When a king died, there could be disputes, brief periods of instability, or even civil war. The throne might pass to a son, but which son if there were several? Or to a brother, an uncle, even a powerful official who married the king's daughter and thus gained a claim to legitimacy? What mattered was maintaining the institution of kingship itself, the divine office that held Egypt together. The physical person might change, might even be violently replaced, but the king as a cosmic principle had to continue. Egypt without a king was unthinkable, a return to the chaos before creation. Chapter 5. The Old Kingdom begins, the Age of Pyramids. And then, slowly, after several centuries of the early dynastic period, Egypt entered what historians call the Old Kingdom, the age when the pyramids rose from the desert, when Egypt's power and confidence reached their first great flowering, when pharaonic civilization achieved a zenith it would never quite reach again. It began with King Djoser of the Third Dynasty, around 2670 BCE, and his brilliant architect Imhotep. Djoser wanted a tomb unlike any that had come before, something that would proclaim his power and ensure his immortality. Imhotep responded with a revolutionary design, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. The Step Pyramid was unprecedented: 6 massive layers of limestone, each smaller than the one below, rising in broad steps toward the sky like a stairway for the gods. It stood nearly 200 feet tall, dominating the landscape, visible for miles. It was the first large-scale stone building in human history, the first architecture that aspired to touch eternity. Before this, monumental buildings were made of mud brick, which was cheap and easy to produce but ultimately impermanent. Mud brick crumbles, erodes, melts back into the earth. Stone is different. Stone endures. Stone is forever. Imagine the workers, thousands of them, quarrying limestone from cliffs not far away. The stone was relatively soft, easy to cut with copper chisels, but still, each block weighed hundreds of pounds. Imagine the blocks being loaded onto wooden sledges, pulled by teams of men chanting in rhythm to coordinate their efforts, overseers marking time with calls and songs. Imagine the pyramid rising, layer by layer, over years and years of continuous work. First the foundation, carefully leveled. Then the first layer, its stones precisely cut and fitted. Then the second layer, set back from the first. Then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, each one smaller, creating the stepped profile. When it was finally complete, the step pyramid was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement, a declaration that Egypt had arrived as a civilization capable of projects that defied comprehension. Imhotep himself became legendary. He was revered for centuries after his death, his wisdom celebrated in proverbs and maxims. Eventually, he was deified, worshipped as a god of wisdom, medicine, and architecture. In later periods, people would travel to his shrine seeking healing or guidance. But in his own time, he was simply a man solving unprecedented problems: how to cut stone precisely, how to transport enormous weights, how to build something that would last forever. The success of the step pyramid inspired the next kings to build their own pyramids, each trying to outdo his predecessor. The pyramid evolved rapidly. The step sides were filled in and covered with smooth limestone casing blocks, creating the familiar pyramidal shape, a perfect geometrical form rising from the desert floor, its polished white limestone surface reflecting the sun like a beacon visible for dozens of miles. Several kings experimented with pyramid designs, some succeeding, some failing spectacularly. The bent pyramid at Dashur starts at one angle and then changes halfway up, perhaps because the builders realized the original angle was too steep and the pyramid was in danger of collapsing. The Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, was the first successful true pyramid, its side smooth and constant from base to apex. And then came the greatest achievement of all. Chapter 6. The Great Pyramid and the Height of the Old Kingdom. Around 2560 BC, King Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops, began building a pyramid at Giza, on a rocky plateau overlooking the Nile Valley in the new city of Memphis. What rose over the next 2 decades was the Great Pyramid, the largest stone structure ever built by hand, a marvel that still defies easy comprehension. The numbers are staggering. The Great Pyramid originally stood 481 feet tall, a 48-story building. Its base covers 13 acres. It contains roughly 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite, each weighing on average 2.5 tons, though some blocks, especially in the internal chambers, weigh 15 tons, 50 tons, even 80 tons. The precision is equally astounding. The base is level to within an inch over the entire 13-acre expanse. The sides are aligned almost perfectly to true north, south, east, and west, with an error of less than 1/10 of a degree. The 4 corners are nearly perfect right angles. This level of accuracy, achieved without modern instruments or technology, speaks to careful planning, skilled engineering, and obsessive attention to detail. How they built it has been debated endlessly. There were no machines in the modern sense, no wheels suitable for heavy transport, no iron tools, only copper chisels and saws, wooden sledges and levers, hemp rope, and human labor. Lots of human labor. Theories abound. Internal ramps spiraling up the sides? External ramps growing longer and higher as the pyramid rose? A combination of ramps, levers, and counterweights? Probably they used several methods, adapting their techniques as they went, solving problems as they arose. What we know for certain is that it wasn't built by slaves, despite what later Greek historians like Herodotus claimed. Workers came from villages all over Egypt, probably as a form of tax service instead of paying grain. Able-bodied men gave several months of labor on royal projects. They worked in rotating shifts, perhaps 3 or 4 months at a time, then returning to their villages for planting or harvest. They were housed in workers' villages. Excavated sites reveal large dormitories, bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves daily, breweries producing vast quantities of beer, even what appears to be a medical facility for treating injuries. The workers were fed well: bread, beer, onions, garlic, and meat, lots of meat, cattle, sheep, goats. Bones found at workers' sites show that the laborers ate better than they probably did in their home villages. Graffiti left by the work gangs gives them names, scrawled in red ochre or carved into hidden stone surfaces: Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaure, the White Crown is powerful. There's a strange kind of pride in those marks, a sense that the workers knew they were building something extraordinary, something that would outlast them all. The pyramid was part of a larger complex. A mortuary temple stood on the pyramid's east side, facing the rising sun, where priests would perform daily rituals to sustain Khufu's spirit. A long causeway connected the mortuary temple to a valley temple down near the river, where Khufu's body would have arrived by boat, been mummified, and prepared for burial. Smaller pyramids stood nearby for Khufu's wives. Boat pits were carved into the bedrock, containing full-size wooden boats, disassembled but preserved, for Khufu to use in the afterlife, to sail with the sun god Are across the sky. One of these boats has been excavated and reconstructed. It's over 140 feet long, an elegant cedar vessel with perfect lines, a masterpiece of ancient shipbuilding. After Khufu, his son Khafre built a slightly smaller pyramid next to his father's. Khafre's pyramid appears taller because it stands on higher ground, and it still retains some of its smooth limestone casing at the apex, giving us a glimpse of how these pyramids originally appeared gleaming white in the sun, their surfaces so smooth you couldn't climb them. Khafre also built or commissioned the Great Sphinx, carved from a single massive outcrop of limestone, a lion's body, 240 feet long, with the head of a king, presumably Khafre himself, though this is debated. The Sphinx faces east, gazing toward the rising sun, guarding the necropolis for eternity. Its face has been weathered by wind and sand for 4,500 years, yet still maintains a calm, enigmatic expression. Khafre's son Menkaure built the third and smallest of the Giza pyramids. Though smallest is relative, it's still 215 feet tall. The three pyramids, aligned in a slightly diagonal row, create one of the most iconic silhouettes in human history, recognizable instantly even to people who know nothing else about Egypt. The Giza complex represented the culmination of pyramid building, the perfection of a form. Later kings would build pyramids, but none quite matched the scale, precision, or ambition of the Fourth Dynasty pyramids. It was as if Egypt had reached a peak it couldn't sustain, had achieved something so extraordinary that even the Egyptians themselves couldn't quite replicate it. Why did they do it? Why invest so much labor, resources, and skill into tombs? The answer lies in how the Egyptians viewed death and the afterlife. Death wasn't an ending but a transformation, a transition to a different state of existence. The body needed to be preserved because the spirit, or rather, multiple spiritual components with different natures and functions, needed a physical anchor. The tomb was a house for eternity, a place where the deceased could dwell, receive offerings, and maintain existence forever. For the king, whose survival after death was tied to the survival of Egypt itself, the stakes were cosmic. His pyramid wasn't just a tomb but a machine for resurrection, its shape perhaps representing the sun's rays solidified, or a stairway to the sky, or the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos at creation. The king would ascend to the sky, joining the sun god Ra in his solar boat, sailing across the heavens by day and through the underworld by night, eternally reborn each dawn. The pyramid was the launching pad for this celestial journey. Chapter 7. Daily Life, Society, and Culture in the Old Kingdom. But what was life like for ordinary people during this golden age? While the pyramids rose at Giza and other royal necropolises, what were the farmers, craftsmen, and scribes doing in villages and towns along the Nile? For the farmers, life hadn't changed dramatically in its essentials. They still worked the fields, still followed the rhythm of the Nile, still planted barley and wheat, onions and lentils, flax for linen. The work was backbreaking, the sun merciless, the days long. But the state's reach had grown longer and more organized. Tax collectors came each year after the harvest, measuring the grain, recording the amounts in neat hieroglyphic script, taking the state's share, perhaps 20 to 30%, varying by region and year. The grain was stored in massive state granaries, tall cylindrical silos with narrow openings at the top. This grain supported the non-farming population, the king and his court, the priesthood, the bureaucracy, the military, the craftsmen and workers on royal projects. It was also stored against lean years when the flood might be low and the harvest poor. Egypt's government was essentially a giant redistribution system, collecting grain from farmers and distributing it as rations to workers and officials. For skilled workers, carpenters, potters, weavers, metalworkers, leather workers, jewelers, there were opportunities. The king's building projects required vast quantities of tools, furniture, rope, baskets, pottery, clothing. Workshops buzzed with activity in Memphis and other cities. Apprentices learned their trades from masters, techniques passed down through generations, trade secrets carefully guarded. A skilled carpenter might specialize in making furniture, beds, chairs, chests, all carefully joined without nails or screws, using mortise and tenon joints and wooden pegs. The wood was often acacia or sycamore, native to Egypt, though cedar imported from Lebanon was prized for its quality and fragrance. The finest pieces were inlaid with ivory, precious stones, and gold. Potters created thousands of vessels, jars for storage, plates and bowls for food, small containers for cosmetics and oils. The potter's wheel was in use, allowing faster, more symmetrical production. Pots were fired in kilns, achieving temperatures high enough to harden the clay permanently. Some pots were left plain, others painted with red or black designs, still others covered with a blue-green glaze that imitated turquoise. Weavers, almost always women, created linen cloth from flax. The flax was grown in fields, harvested, soaked in water to loosen the fibers, dried, beaten, combed, and finally spun into thread on simple spindles. The thread was woven on horizontal looms, creating fabric of various qualities from coarse sacking to fine, almost transparent cloth that the wealthy wore in the heat. Scribes occupied a particularly privileged position. Literacy was rare, a skill that required years of training, starting in childhood. Boys from elite families, and a few from lower classes who showed promise, were sent to scribal schools attached to temples or government offices. There they learned to read and write hieroglyphs, sitting cross-legged on the ground, papyrus sheets on their laps, learning to form each sign precisely. They learned mathematics, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions necessary for calculating areas of fields, volumes of granaries, quantities of materials for building projects. They learned to draft legal documents, write letters, compose official inscriptions. A text from a later period captures the pride of the scribal profession: be a scribe. Your limbs will be sleek, your hands will be soft. You will go forth in white clothes, honored, with courtiers saluting you. In contrast to the farmer, his fingers stink like fish, or the metal worker, his hands are rough like crocodile skin, or the potter, grubbing in mud more than a pig. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed more rights and freedoms than in many other ancient societies. They could own property in their own names, not just as part of a husband's estate. They could buy and sell, conduct business, lend and borrow. They could initiate divorce, though this was probably rare and carried social stigma. If a marriage ended, the woman had rights to a share of property and support. Most women's lives centered on the home. They ground grain on stone querns, a task that could take hours each day, and wore down tooth enamel from grit in the flour. Skeletal remains show extensive dental wear in ancient Egyptians. They baked bread, brewed beer, cooked meals, wove cloth, made clothing, maintained the household, raised children. But some women held positions outside the home. Priestesses served in temples, performing rituals, singing hymns, playing music. Some women managed estates, overseeing agricultural production and workers. There are occasional references to women physicians, though this was rare. The highest position a woman could hold was probably God's wife of Ammonius, a powerful priestess role that emerged in later periods, but even in the Old Kingdom, some royal women wielded considerable influence. Children played with simple toys that have survived in tombs: balls made from papyrus or leather, carved wooden animals on wheels, dolls made from clay or wood, tops that could be spun. They swam and fished in the canals, learned to handle small boats. Boys helped their fathers in fields or workshops, learning the skills they'd need as adults. Girls helped their mothers, learning to weave, cook, manage households. Education for most children was informal, learning by doing, by imitation, by listening to parents and elders. Formal schooling was rare, limited to boys training to be scribes or priests. The vast majority of Egyptians remained illiterate throughout their lives. In the evenings, when the heat of the day slowly faded, families gathered for meals. The diet was simple but adequate: bread, which came in many varieties, beer, consumed by adults and children alike, onions and garlic, eaten in vast quantities, lentils and other legumes, fish, either fresh from the Nile or dried and salted, occasionally meat, goat, sheep, beef, or poultry, especially on festival days. The wealthy ate more variety: roasted duck, beef ribs, grapes, and figs, honey as a sweetener, wine imported from the delta or the oases. They used more spices and flavorings: coriander, cumin, dill. They ate from fine pottery or even metal vessels, using their fingers but also spoons for liquids. They had servants to prepare and serve food. After the meal, there might be music, someone playing a harp or flute, someone singing. Stories were told, probably the same stories that had been told for generations: tales of the gods, legends of heroes and kings, folk tales about talking animals and magical transformations. The stars emerged, impossibly bright in the clear desert air, and the Egyptians, who studied the sky carefully, recognized patterns and named them. Eventually, people climbed to the flat roofs of their houses to sleep in the cool night air, or stayed inside if the wind was strong and dusty. They lay on simple beds, wooden frames with woven reed mattresses, or on mats on the floor. The wealthy had linen sheets and wooden headrests carved with protective symbols. Then darkness and sleep, and the cycle would begin again with dawn. Chapter 8. Religion, Art, and the Egyptian Worldview. The Egyptians were thinking deeply and constantly about the nature of existence, the relationship between gods and humans, the mystery of death and what came after. Religion wasn't separate from daily life, it was woven into every action, every decision, every moment. The gods were many, taking countless forms. Some were cosmic Ra, the sun god, his journey across the sky marking the passage of day, Nut, the sky goddess, her body arching over the earth, Geb, the earth god, lying beneath her. Some were forces of nature, Hapi, god of the Nile flood, Hapi, a different god despite the similar name, representing abundance. Some were abstract concepts, Mat, goddess of truth and order, Hu and Sia, gods of authoritative speech and perception. Many gods took animal forms or combined human and animal features. Anubis, god of embalming and guide to the afterlife, had a jackal's head. Thoth, god of writing and wisdom, appeared as an ibis or a baboon. Hathor could be a cow, a woman with cow's ears, or a woman with a headdress of cow horns framing a sun disk. Sobek was a crocodile or a man with a crocodile's head. These weren't crude or primitive beliefs. The animal forms were symbolic, representing aspects of the god's nature. The jackal scavenged in cemeteries, so Anubis, who protected the dead, took a jackal's form. The ibis had a curved beak like a crescent moon and was associated with Thoth, who measured time. The cow was gentle and nurturing, like Hathor, goddess of love and motherhood. Each region, each city, each village had its own patron deity, its own local variant of the larger pantheon. When political centers shifted, their gods gained prominence. When dynasties changed, new gods might rise to prominence while older ones faded or merged with others. The sun god Ra became increasingly important during the Old Kingdom. The king was understood to be Ra's son, his earthly embodiment. At death, the king would ascend to the sky, joining Ra in his solar boat as it journeyed each day across the heavens and each night through the underworld, battling the serpent Apophis, embodiment of chaos, who tried each night to prevent the sun's rebirth. The afterlife was the Egyptians' great obsession and achievement. They believed that each person had multiple spiritual components, the Ka, a kind of life force or vital essence, the Ba, something like a soul or personality that could leave the body and move about, the Ak, a transfigured spirit that could exist in the afterlife, literally meaning the effective one or the luminous one. For these spiritual components to survive death, the body had to be preserved. Early burials in desert sand naturally desiccated bodies, preserving them. But as tombs grew more elaborate, bodies buried underground in coffins would decay. The embalmers had to learn to preserve bodies artificially. Mummification developed slowly over centuries. By the Old Kingdom, the basic process was established, though it would be refined over time. The internal organs were removed, first the brain, extracted through the nose with a long hook, then the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, removed through an incision in the side. The heart was left in place because it was the seat of intelligence and personality. The body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt, which dried out the tissues over 40 days. Then it was washed, rubbed with oils and resins, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Amulets were placed among the wrappings for protection. The whole process took 70 days and was accompanied by prayers and rituals. The mummy was placed in a coffin, which might be placed in another coffin, and finally in a stone sarcophagus. The tomb was stocked with everything needed for the afterlife: food, drink, clothing, furniture, tools, jewelry, cosmetics, games, books of spells. The walls of tombs were decorated with scenes of daily life: farming, hunting, fishing, feasting, musicians and dancers. These weren't merely decorative. They were magical, ensuring these activities would continue in the afterlife. If you painted it, it became real in the afterlife. If you carved it in stone, it was eternal. Art followed strict conventions that lasted thousands of years. Human figures were depicted in a distinctive composite style, the head in profile, showing the distinctive Egyptian nose and jaw, the eye frontal, as if looking out of the page, the shoulders frontal, showing both shoulders and the chest, the waist, hips, and legs in profile, showing the contours of the body. This wasn't a lack of artistic skill or inability to draw realistically. It was a deliberate choice, showing each part of the body from its most recognizable, most characteristic angle. The goal wasn't to capture a moment or a perspective, as in Western art after the Renaissance. The goal was to show the eternal essence of things, to create an image that would remain true and effective forever. Scale indicated importance. The king towered over his subjects in reliefs and paintings, often twice their size. Tomb owners were larger than their servants and workers. Husbands were often shown larger than their wives, parents larger than children. This didn't reflect physical reality but social hierarchy and importance. Sculpture aimed for ideal, eternal forms. Statues of kings and nobles were smooth, ageless, serene. Even if the person had been old or ill in life, their statue showed them in perfect health, eternally youthful, ready for eternity. The body was idealized, athletic but not over-muscled, serene but not expressionless. Yet there was also room for realism and individuality when appropriate. Some portrait statues capture distinct personalities, a scribe with an alert, intelligent expression, his eyes inlaid with rock crystal, a dwarf portrayed with dignity and anatomical accuracy, workers and servants shown with the lean, muscular bodies of people who labored physically all their lives. Literature was developing, though frustratingly little survives from the Old Kingdom. Papyrus is fragile, and most has been lost. We have fragments of wisdom texts, offering advice on how to live a good life, how to behave properly in society, how to speak truthfully and act with justice. The instructions of Ptahhotep, attributed to a vizier under King Jedkar in the 5th dynasty, is one of the earliest wisdom texts. It counsels moderation, humility, respect for elders, careful speech. If you are a leader, be calm as you listen to the speech of a petitioner. Do not stop him before he has emptied his body of what he planned to say. A man in distress wants to pour out his heart more than to have his case adjudicated. If you cut off his speech, he will say, "Why does he reject my petition?" The advice is practical, timeless, recognizable even now. Listen carefully, speak thoughtfully, respect those above you, be kind to those below you, work hard, be patient, value wisdom over wealth, marry well, raise your children properly, honor the gods, prepare for death. Music was everywhere in Egyptian life, at festivals and religious processions, in temples during rituals, at banquets and celebrations, even in fields where workers sang to coordinate their labor. Musicians played harps with many strings, producing soft, sweet sounds, flutes made from reed or wood, drums and tambourines setting rhythm, clappers and sistrums, a kind of rattle, providing percussive accents. Singers chanted hymns to the gods, praising their attributes and deeds. Love songs celebrated romantic passion with surprising directness. Workers' songs coordinated labor and lifted spirits. The music itself is lost. The Egyptians had no musical notation, but images of musicians and descriptions of performances survive, and we can imagine the sounds filling temples and palaces, drifting across the Nile on festival nights. Chapter 9. Trade, Foreign Relations, and the Wider World. Egypt's geographic isolation was never absolute. Trade routes stretched in all directions, and while Egypt remained culturally distinct, it was connected to a wider world through exchange of goods, ideas, and occasionally people. To the south lay Nubia, the land the Egyptians called Taseti, the land of the bow, because Nubians were famous archers. Nubia was rich in resources Egypt lacked: gold in abundance, ivory from elephants, ebony wood, incense, exotic animal skins, leopards, giraffes, even lions. Nubian mercenaries served in Egypt's military. Nubian dwarfs were valued at the Egyptian court, perhaps as entertainers or for religious reasons. Relations with Nubia alternated between trade and conflict, cooperation and domination. Sometimes Egyptian expeditions traveled south to trade peacefully. Sometimes they raided, seizing goods and captives. Sometimes they established trading posts or forts. The relationship was complex, evolving over centuries, with periods of Egyptian dominance alternating with periods of Nubian independence and even, much later, Nubian conquest of Egypt. The Sinai Peninsula, the harsh desert triangle between Egypt and Asia, was strategically and economically vital. It provided copper, mined from surface deposits and shallow pits. Copper was essential for tools and weapons, sharper and more durable than stone, though not as strong as the bronze, copper mixed with tin, that would come later, or the iron that came later still. The Sinai also provided turquoise, a beautiful blue-green stone prized for jewelry and inlays. Egyptian mining expeditions traveled into the Sinai regularly, workers extracting ore under brutal conditions, intense heat, scarce water, isolation. The expeditions were guarded by soldiers because the Sinai was also home to Bedouin peoples who sometimes attacked or raided. Inscriptions carved into rocks at mining sites record successful expeditions, give thanks to the gods, commemorate the officials who led them. To the northeast, beyond the Sinai, lay the Levant, the lands we now call Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. These were Egypt's most important trading partners. Cedar wood came from the mountains of Lebanon, tall, straight trees with fragrant, rot-resistant wood perfect for building ships, constructing palace roofs and temple beams. Egypt had no tall trees, its native trees, acacia, sycamore, tamarisk, were small. They were suitable for furniture and tools but not for monumental construction. From Levantine ports came olive oil, wine, and manufactured goods. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone with flecks of gold like pyrite, came ultimately from Afghanistan, traveling through many hands along trade routes. Silver came from Anatolia, modern Turkey. Both were rare in Egypt and thus highly valued. Egyptian expeditions also traveled to Punt, a land somewhere along the Red Sea coast, perhaps modern Eritrea, Somalia, or Yemen. The exact location is debated. From Punt came myrrh and frankincense, aromatic resins burned as incense in temples. Myrrh trees were brought back alive and planted in Egypt. Punt also provided leopard skins, gold, ebony, and other exotic goods. The Egyptians called Punt God's land, suggesting it had religious significance or simply that its products were essential for religious rituals. These expeditions were major undertakings. Ships had to be built on the Mediterranean coast, dismantled, carried overland to the Red Sea, reassembled, then sailed down the Red Sea coast, a journey of months. One inscription from the reign of King Sahur in the 5th dynasty records an expedition that brought back enormous quantities of myrrh, 80,000 measures worth, along with silver, electrum, a gold-silver alloy, and even living dwarfs. But Egypt didn't seek to conquer these distant lands. There was no Egyptian empire in the Old Kingdom, no colonies, no permanent occupation of foreign territory. Egypt was sufficient unto itself, the center of the world in Egyptian eyes. Foreign lands were useful as sources of goods, sometimes as threats to be repelled, but not as places to rule. This would change in later periods. The New Kingdom would build an empire stretching from Nubia to Syria, but in the Old Kingdom, Egypt's foreign policy was essentially defensive and commercial. Guard the borders, especially in the northeast where Asian peoples might infiltrate the delta. Send expeditions to get what Egypt needed. Maintain trade relationships. But don't overextend. The Egyptian worldview was centered on Egypt itself. Egyptian maps placed Egypt in the middle, surrounded by foreign lands inhabited by people who were interesting but inferior, exotic but not quite fully human. The Egyptians developed stereotypes of foreigners. Nubians were dark-skinned, strong, good archers. Libyans were lighter-skinned, wore distinctive feathered headdresses. Asiatics had pointed beards and colorful robes. These stereotypes, repeated in art and text, were caricatures, but they reveal how Egyptians saw themselves as the normal, civilized people, with everyone else being variations or deviations from the Egyptian norm. Chapter 10. The Decline of the Old Kingdom and Legacy. No golden age lasts forever. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom was weakening. The causes were complex, interwoven, and gradual, not a sudden catastrophe but a slow unraveling. The kings had been generous, perhaps too generous, granting vast estates and tax exemptions to temples and powerful nobles. These grants were often permanent, passing from generation to generation. Over time, this eroded the royal tax base. The king controlled less and less of Egypt's agricultural wealth, while temples and noble families controlled more and more. The nomarchs, governors of Egypt's provinces, had grown increasingly powerful and independent. Positions that had once been appointments by the king, revocable at his pleasure, had become hereditary. Nomarchs passed their positions to their sons, building up local power bases, administering justice, commanding local troops, building elaborate tombs in their own provinces rather than near the king's pyramid. Some nomarchs were becoming petty kings in their own territories, acknowledging the pharaoh's nominal supremacy but otherwise governing independently. They built palaces, maintained courts, conducted their own foreign relations with nearby regions. The unity of Egypt was fracturing. The climate may have been changing again. Some paleoclimate evidence suggests a period of lower Nile floods during the late Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. Lower floods meant lower harvests. Food shortages led to unrest. Hungry people lose faith in their rulers, especially rulers whose primary legitimacy was supposed to ensure the Nile would flood properly. The kings themselves may have weakened. King Pepi II, who came to the throne as a child, supposedly ruled for 94 years, probably an exaggeration, but he did reign for a very long time, perhaps 60 to 70 years. Imagine the problems: a king growing old, perhaps senile, outliving all his expected heirs, while ambitious nobles jockeyed for power and no clear succession plan existed. When Pepi II finally died, the throne passed through several weak or short-lived kings. Authority collapsed. The Sixth Dynasty ended not with a dramatic conquest but with a whimper, the kingdom fracturing into competing power centers. The First Intermediate period followed a time of division, local rulers fighting for control, multiple kings claiming legitimacy simultaneously, economic disruption, and cultural pessimism. Later Egyptian texts looked back on this period with horror, describing it as a time when Ma'at was broken, when the world was turned upside down, when the poor became rich and the rich became poor, when foreigners entered Egypt, when sons killed fathers and brother fought brother. Some of this was probably exaggeration, a literary topos, a way of emphasizing how wonderful it was when Egypt was reunified. But there was real disruption. The collapse of central authority meant the breakdown of the redistribution system, the abandonment of major building projects, the end of large-scale foreign expeditions. Yet even in this period of chaos, Egyptian culture persisted. Art continued, following the same conventions. Temples were maintained, if on a smaller scale. Local rulers styled themselves as pharaohs, claiming they were restoring Ma'at, asserting continuity even in discontinuity. Egypt would eventually reunify under the 11th dynasty, beginning the Middle Kingdom. But that's a story for another night. Our focus tonight has been on the rise, the long, slow accumulation of people, practices, and beliefs that created Old Kingdom Egypt. What the Old Kingdom left behind was extraordinary and lasting. The pyramids, of course, monuments so enduring they've outlasted the civilization that built them by more than a millennium, standing now in a world the ancient Egyptians could never have imagined, surrounded by modern cities, photographed by tourists from every nation, studied by scientists with tools that seem like magic. But more than physical monuments, the Old Kingdom established patterns and ideals that would define Egypt for 3,000 years. The concept of divine kingship, the pharaoh as the intermediary between gods and humans, the guarantor of cosmic order. The massive bureaucracy, the armies of scribes recording everything. The obsession with permanence and eternity, with defeating death through preservation and ritual. The distinctive art style that would remain virtually unchanged for millennia. The hieroglyphic script. The elaborate religion with its many gods and complex mythology. And perhaps most fundamentally, the Old Kingdom created Egypt's sense of itself, a nation defined by a river, protected by deserts, favored by the gods, existing in perfect balance between order and chaos, between the fertile black land and the lifeless red land. This self-image would sustain Egypt through periods of collapse and foreign domination, through conquest and occupation, right down to the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE, when finally, after more than 3,000 years, Egypt was transformed into something new, its ancient language forgotten, its gods abandoned, its temples empty. But all of that was far, unimaginably far, in the future. For now, in the Old Kingdom, Egypt was at its beginning, still young, still confident, still building the foundations of a civilization that would become, in many ways, immortal. The pyramids still stand. The Sphinx still gazes toward the dawn. The Nile still flows, as it always has, bringing life to the desert. And somewhere, in some museum vault or forgotten tomb, objects made by Old Kingdom hands still exist: a clay pot, a copper chisel, a scrap of papyrus with faded hieroglyphs whispering across 4,500 years, telling us, we were here, we lived, we built, we dreamed of forever. And that's where we'll leave ancient Egypt tonight, with the pyramids standing in the desert, monuments to human ambition and faith, with the Nile still flowing, as it always has, bringing life to the valley, with generations of people living and working, farming and building, loving and mourning, under the vast Egyptian sky. The details have faded into time, but the essence remains: a civilization that found its rhythm in the pulse of a river, that built for eternity, that believed in order and balance, in Ma'at. Let those images drift through your mind as you drift toward sleep. The golden light on the pyramids at dawn. The dark, fertile fields. The river, always flowing, patient and eternal. There's nothing more you need to do tonight. Just rest. If this story brought you calm, I'd appreciate it if you could like, share, and leave a quiet comment about which historical time or place you'd like to drift into next. Good night.